Hello, I am Coro Arizmendi. I am a full-time professor at the National University of Mexico, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mylea Bayless. She leads Bat Conservation International Network and Partnership Division with over 20 years of experience in building collaborative teams for conservation, research, and wildlife management. She has been integral to BCR mission for more than a decade, leading the conservation team in the US and Canada. Bayless joined BCI in 2006 with a career portfolio including state and federal agency service and academic research. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey guys, good morning. I hope you can hear me. I have a little cold, so somebody wave your hand if I get a little scratchy in the back. Okay. Let's see. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about one of my favorite pollinators and one of my favorite parts of the world. Today we're going to be talking about the Leptonicterus, the nectar-feeding bats in the southwestern U.S. and Mexico. Just to get us all on the same page before we start, let's talk about bat pollination in general. We've been hearing a lot about the other really important pollinators that are working for us every day. But many of you may not think about bats as pollinators. Some of you may think about bats mostly as eating insects. But in fact, there's a lot of bats that pollinate plants around the world. It's relatively uncommon when compared with bird and insect pollinations, but they are involved in an impressive number of both economically and ecologically important plants. So bat pollination occurs in about 528 plant species of 67 families and 28 orders of angiosperms worldwide, and many large-scale cash crops that are originally dispersed or pollinated by plants, and these include bananas, mangoes, breadfruits, agave, durian, and pitay, as well as the economically important mawa, kapak, balsa, and shea butter trees. And I point you to this Kuntz et al. Paper, 2011, that you can find in the Annual of New York Academy of Sciences that provides a really wonderful overview of all the ecosystem services that bats provide, and I can provide you with a copy of that paper if you can't find one online. All right, so bats do this by using their long, specially adapted tongues to reach deep into the flowers of night-blooming plants to reach the nectar, and in doing so, they accumulate the pollen and transport it to the next flower that they visit. And so because feeding on nectar and pollen requires relatively specialized morphology for bats, like long tongues and elongated snouts, relatively few members of these families are obligate pollinators, but about 38 species and 16 genera are specialized nectar feeders. In comparison, there's about 90 species and 22 genera that are frugivorous, but many of those visit the flowers of the plants as well. And then I would also point you for more information to this website, batplant.org, which is relatively new. It just got up and running this year, and it's a website that focuses on the interactions between bats and plants, and now we're starting to put some data in there on insects that are predated by bats as well. So this is populated by the academic community, and if you'd like to contribute to this literature review, or if you'd like to find more information, this is a really wonderful website. So now let's shift gears a little bit to talk about the American Southwest and Mexico. We've been seeing a lot of pictures of beautiful grasslands and flowers, and a lot of you might think of these arid ecosystems as being less diverse than other parts of the country, but in fact, that's really far from the truth. They're rich with endemic biodiversity and these unique ecosystems that support a whole range of species, and many of those species are pollinators, and many of these arid plants rely very specifically on pollinators. You're all familiar with monarch butterfly and migratory hummingbirds, but there's another group of migratory animals, and these are bats that depend on the chronological blooming of the plants in this region to make their migratory journeys. So we're particularly interested, and I'd like to talk today about 2 species of migratory nectar bats that live throughout central and northern Mexico and in the southwestern United States. And these are the Mexican long-nosed bat, Leptonicterus nivalis, and the lesser long-nosed bat, Leptonicterus yerbabuena. The Mexican long-nosed bat is listed as federally endangered, excuse me, and the lesser long-nosed bat was recently delisted from both Mexico and the United States, which is a real success story for us. This is the distribution of these 2 pollinating bat species, and some portions of the species migrate from central and southern Mexico all the way up into the United States, and then other portions of the populations will just migrate shorter distances between their summer and winter cave sites. These bats, they roost in caves and mines where they're protected from the elements and they can raise their young under the really unique microclimatic conditions that the bats need to grow and reproduce. And all the recovery plans and the conservation strategies set up for these species have very specific goals and targets for protecting the cave roosts for nectar bats. And BCI, the organization that I work for, is currently actively engaged in protecting all of the existing known cave roosts for these species, but we're also out looking for new cave roosts, as well as a lot of partner organizations. But the bats don't just need places to live, they need things to eat too, right? So these 2 species of bats feed primarily on agave and columnar cacti. Leptonicterus yerbabuena, the lesser long-nosed bat, has a much more diverse diet, but Leptonicterus nivalis, the Mexican long-nosed bat, is really closely linked to agave entirely for their food. These agave form large rosettes that might take years to flower, and then they put up these large flower stalks that have an impressive flowering display. And the flowers are light in color that makes them easy for the bats to find, and they're also quite pungent, which is perfectly suited for bat pollination. Another thing to mention about agave is that they're long-lived and monocarpic, which means they die after they reproduce, after they flower. And so the plants have to reproduce either by seeds, but often they reproduce by pups or clones as well. So the genus Agave is incredibly diverse with over 220 species worldwide, and Mexico has the greatest species richness of all the agave in the world. So we'll come back to this later when we talk about the diversity of agave and why there's such a deep connection between agave and the cultural connection to this group of plants that many people in this region have. So the specialized diet of nectar points to another element for species recovery that is highlighted in all of the conservation planning documents, and that's to protect and enhance the foraging habitat for these species. And agave will bloom in specific locations, and sometimes the caves that these bats roost in are quite far from the blooming agave, which can create quite an energetic demand for these bats as they move from where they live to where they eat. And so also currently, many of these landscapes are degraded for various reasons, overgrazing and fire and agricultural development and land conversion. And as our human population increases in a lot of this part of the world, so then will we see a decrease in the number of flowering agave and an increase in distances between where the food is and where the caves are. And so throughout this range, we really believe that maintaining adequate foraging for these bats is going to be critical to their survival. But restoration, many people think of restoration as looking like this, right? With lots of plants on the landscape and big, vast areas. But it also can look like this. And in the American Southwest, and where we have lots of human encroachment, getting restoration on the ground where we can is going to be more important than saving our chits for when we can have big swaths of restoration. I mean, both things can work together in concert for protecting these species. And the good thing for us is that the plants that these bats eat are really beautiful, and they're really easy to maintain, and they're easy to care for. So not only do they work well in a large-scale restoration scenario with limited maintenance after you plant the agave, but also in a xeric garden, or in a garden that is low maintenance. And coming back to Margaret's presentation, this is just another example of how every act of conservation can make a difference. So restoring agave on the landscape, they really help more than just the bats and the other pollinators. It also is part of the natural landscape and the cultural identity for many people in this region, particularly in Mexico, where agave is, or maguey, as the plants are referred to in Spanish, are really part of this Mexican culture. The thick fibrous leaves of the maguey are used for fibers and ropes, and they're fed to livestock in dry years. And aguamiel, which is the sugary pulp that's extracted from the stalks, is used like sugar cane. And the sap of the maguey is used for several types of beverages, including pulque and mezcal, and even tequila, which you and I are probably more familiar with. And a lot of the Native American cultures also they have a lot of the same uses for agave in their cultures in this part of the region as well. So in many ways, the maguey are Mexico. And the restoration efforts, when they're closely monitored for a sustainable harvest in partnership with the communities, are really going to be an important cultural addition to the landscape as well as ecological. So the other thing that these communities use agave for are living fences and for erosion control. And this also presents a really unique opportunity to put food on the landscape for the bats and also meet the needs of the communities. I'd like to call your attention to this PhD student, Christine Lear from the University of Georgia, who's doing some really groundbreaking work in this area. And she's working closely with the rural communities and the ejidos in northern Mexico to try and understand how agave restoration might be perceived in their community and how it might benefit that community and what barriers to implementation we might find as we expand this idea into Mexico. And she's got a great Instagram feed. If you want to follow her, I've put it up. Oops, I'm sorry. I didn't change the slide for you. I put it up here so that you can follow the great work that she's doing. So there's some really good news in that we see what focused conservation can do. In this case, we saw the lesser long-nosed bat come off the endangered species list once their roosts were protected and their foraging areas were stabilized. And so there's a role that we can all play in doing the same thing for Leptonicterus nivalis. There are several ways that we can all help migratory bats. So surveying for new cave roosts and protecting these cave roosts really requires a specialized set of skills, and there's really good people working on that. Bat Conservation International and the Nivalis Conservation Network and many faculty at several universities are really focused, very focused, on making sure these cave roosts are protected. But there are a lot of things you and I can do to directly help these species, ranging from making a long-term commitment to restoring agave to making a sustainable Friday night choice when you go down to watch the ball game at the bar tonight. Because we're all going to do that, right? So the first thing I want to tell you about is that BCI has developed a partnership program to restore native habitat that includes flowering agave to provide these nectar resources for both the Mexican and the lesser long-nosed bats. And through this program, we're really hoping to engage private corporations and private landowners, as well as agencies and partners and volunteer groups and Boy Scouts and clubs and anybody who's interested in planting agave for bats. It's really modeled after the popular conservation efforts with the monarch butterfly, and so we're really reliant on lots of sites over a large landscape to make a difference for the species and fuel the bats, the migrations as they move up and back through Mexico and the southwestern United States. So throughout this network, our partners are going to be collecting native seed. They're going to be growing and planting locally sourced agave. In cases where agave will be damaged by development, there's a plan in place for salvage and relocation for agave. And then this patchwork of plants is going to help the bats use that migratory corridor. There's some specific targets for participation in this program. So if you're interested in the specifics of it and you'd like to participate, come find me during this meeting and I can provide you with that. I'd also like to mention, I'm so glad that I came directly after Margaret, but the Wildlife Habitat Council has been collaborating with us, and this agave restoration program for most sites will certify you for a Wildlife Habitat Council certification. The other thing you could do is consider hosting a planting event or outreach during Pollinator Week or Bat Week. I mean, Bat Week's just around the corner. You still have time to plan. And so this is a great way that you can engage your community or engage others through personal experience, not just telling them that contributing to conservation is important, but getting your hands dirty, putting some plants in the ground, or having that personal connection with nature. So this is a shout out to our friends at the Wildlife Habitat Council again in Freeport-McMoran, who partnered with BCI to hold multiple public events last October promoting Bat Week and promoting pollinators at 4 of their sites through outreach and volunteer agave plantings in their communities. And you guys all like tequila, right? I heard everybody smile when I started talking about that. An easier thing yet is to make a sustainable food and drink choice. So you can do this with pollinating bats in mind. These 2 creative entrepreneurs, Dr. Rodrigo Medellin from the University of Mexico and David Suro, have developed a concept to persuade tequila producers to leave 5% of their crop to flower for the bats. And so that leaves a little nectar for the bats in return for special recognition of that crop of tequila as bat-friendly. Last year, they launched about 350,000 bottles of bat-friendly tequila, and you can find this at Espita and other mezcalerias that have artisanal tequilas and mezcal, and even at your local liquor store. So I know we don't have time for questions during the presentations, but please find me during the conference. I'm happy to talk about this program. I'm happy to talk about pollinating bats in general or answer any other questions you may have. Thank you.